Hello and welcome back to the Playdate. I'm Frances Fishman, your host, and today I am I'm over the moon, to be honest, because this is a conversation that means so much to me. I have the incredible Dr. Tay with me, and I have been following you for a long time and have been so in love with your message. And I want to spread your message. And recently, actually, one of my analysts from Toronto shared one of your podcasts, and I was like, oh yeah, I want to listen to this one too. Um, because everything you share is, I just find it to be incredibly meaningful, but I also find it to be so helpful. So I wanted to be a little bit of I wanted to give a little bit of an intro, but I also want you to introduce yourself because I think your story is a beautiful one. So I'd love to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself. So go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I love being on podcasts and being able to, my ultimate goal is to help parents of autistic kids or, if they're not even identified as autistic yet, how we can help them learn more neurodiversity affirming approaches and also not only have a guide for themselves on this journey, but also, or not only for their children, but also for themselves.
Yeah.
So I am a licensed psychologist by training. My full name is Dr. Taylor Day. And it was one of these things that once I started my platform, I kind of coined myself as Dr. Tay, and it has
Mhm.
really, really stuck. And yeah, I think ultimately I came from an academic background, so was in academia doing research. Ultimately, like that was my dream career, and then realized it wasn't my dream because I really wanted to be able to have impact for families and be able to help get them the right information and provide them guidance. And a lot of that comes from my own kind of personal background. So I have a brother who's 10 years younger than me who was diagnosed at 23 months of age. So a long time ago, really, really young at, that time. I think it was 2001, if I'm doing math correctly, when he was diagnosed. And so even now, we don't see that young of diagnoses, even though it's possible. And we see some families, but as a whole, but my mom in particular really advocated for the diagnosis because she knew something was different and he needed more support. And ultimately, though, I really come at everything as I'm a child psychologist by training, although I've done a lot of adult training as well. But, I had the opportunity in my training at Duke University Medical Center to learn about family therapy and coming at everything from this whole family approach. So that's ultimately something that I developed and coined of like, how can we focus on your autistic child, but support the entire family system around your autistic child? And that really came about because my brother got incredible supports. We had therapists in our house all the time. And, he really got the best of the best, if I'm being honest, and a lot of that was again because of my mom's advocacy. But what I realized is no one was supporting them, and in turn no one was supporting me and knowing how to process this. And so some of it is realizing still what a gap that is. I love that we focus on the autistic child themselves, but autism doesn't just impact the child, it impacts the whole family system. And so I really feel passionate about changing the approach of how we support to make sure it also is including, the family system around that autistic child.
I think that's so beautiful and needed. And the reason I say that is that, as myself being a BCBA and working with families and children, the impact we make when we work directly just with the child is so limiting. And also, we
Mhm.
can feel that. And in some cases, therapy is sought out because a school recommends it and not because a family feels that it's something that they need. Also, I know ABA has a terrible reputation it has earned. Um, it is very rightly earned, in my opinion. Um, And so there's a lot of fear around the therapy and disconnection from the therapy. But when we work with an entire system as opposed to just an individual, the impact is infinite. And I think one of the questions I had written down that I really wanted to ask you, because I've heard you speak about it so beautifully, is what would you what would you say to a family where there are siblings involved? Siblings who may not need the same kinds of support that their autistic child needs. Is there a specific message or um, something you want to share about your experience, or something that you would recommend that they look at in a particular way when it comes to their other children or child?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the most predominant messages that I realized I embodied growing up, it took therapy, my like being in therapy myself to really unpack this. And no one ever told me this. And this can be hard for parents to hear. But I was of the mindset that if my brother needed help, that meant I couldn't need help, right? Right. And that I you know, I had to be highly independent, and I was really, I'm a high achiever by nature. That still is very much part of my personality. But at the same point is making sure that that didn't become everything. And I think growing up, like I thought that like, okay, I just have to do well. I can't need the support. And again, I when I tell you that, like, when I shared this with my mom, she was like, "No, that's not true." Like, and I know that. Like, it would have broken her heart to know that that's how I was thinking. And I even think, I'm 35 at this point, and when I shared it with my mom now, it still did. And so it's this subconscious thing that comes about neurotypes and helping. Some of the biggest things, I knew, or my mom talks about this story really quickly. So I was 10 years older. So I would come home on the bus and they'd be doing, and my brother did ABA therapy. They would be doing like very naturalistic play-based ABA therapy, again, ahead of its time, but they had a therapy room built out in our basement. And the therapist would tell my mom, like, if my brother was having a meltdown, like, no, you can't go upstairs, because if you leave, that reinforces the behavior, which is such an interesting concept. We could have a whole topic on,
Yep.
and a whole podcast on, so I won't go there. But my mom would say, like, yeah, it broke my heart. It felt sometimes like I was having to choose between my children's needs. And I think that's the thing, that it is hard to hear, but we need to be having these conversations. Imagine, again, my mom wasn't supported, and I don't blame my mom in the slightest for this, but imagine if she had gotten support that's like, hey, you need to be having conversations with Taylor of like, how is she feeling, right? And allowing her a safe split space to even express frustration at times, or sadness or grief even of the diagnosis. Imagine too if she said to me, here's what's going on. I am so sorry. And how can we make sure that once I am able to finally come up, again, I would not recommend that. Just to be clear, as a clinician, I'm saying there's ways to do this, but like, just imagine if that was the same situation, that she could have said, okay, I can't come up right now, but how can we connect after? And then additionally, she does say, she's like, I wish I would have told that therapist no. I knew in my gut that wasn't the right thing to do on both sides, right? Like, she felt sometimes disconnected from my brother in that way, but then also disconnected from me. And all she was trying to do was the right thing that these specialists were recommending. And she was overriding her maternal instinct as a result of that. But imagine bringing that to life and having that be a conversation, it completely shifts everything.
Totally. And I think your lived experience is one that I think probably many people experience, is this feeling of, you know, my sibling needs the support, so I I really should keep it together because I shouldn't need it. And not that you can't
Mhm.
need it, but it's a story that you create in order to make sense of what you're experiencing. And that makes total
Right.
sense. Um,
Absolutely.
and it's not because anyone ever told you you're not allowed to have needs, but it's because that's the feeling you had based on what you were experiencing in that moment. Um, and what your mom experienced, um, I have witnessed myself as well. And I think that I got very lucky early on in my career to do a very naturalistic, play based approach that I was trained by a BCBAD to implement right from the beginning. Um, she was definitely ahead of her time. When I left her company, I realized literally nobody else did what she was doing, and I was totally lost. But there are still elements of this field, which is something I want to speak to you about, um, that require change.
Mhm.
And, I was trained to do things that even, with everything that all the beauty that she had in the programming and how naturalistic and child-led and adult guided it was, there's still things that I was trained to do that I just recently had a training with my RBTs around touching their clients
Mhm.
and how we don't. And if you do, you need consent. And what does consent look like and sound like? And when would it be appropriate, and had to model different opportunities of when it might be appropriate and what, consent looks and sounds like. And um, what happened, and then I had an RBT ask me a great question. And she said, you know, I was taught that if a teacher said, go sit in the chair and the child flops on the ground, I give them the choice to do it themselves or with my help. And my help means I'm picking you up and I'm taking you to the chair. And I was like, oh, I was trained to do the same, but we don't do
Mhm.
that. And I explained why. And I gave so many other options for what you do in that moment, and how it was just such an interesting conversation because it really made me reflect to like, oh, I was trained to do the same thing. Not that I have you do the same thing now, but I was trained to do that. And I'm curious what your experience has been, um, being a witness to ABA at a young age, being a professional now who works with children who receive ABA services of all different kinds, I'm sure, um, and somebody who's had many conversations around this topic. What is your feeling, and not necessarily like clinical opinion, but what is your feeling around this field and where it's at today?
That's such a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think for context, two pieces are true of what I saw as a kid myself. So
Mhm.
I would have been 12 through 14 when my brother was going through ABA. He was getting 40 hours a week in our home for 2 years straight. The interesting thing is, I don't know that much about it because I wasn't usually part of it. And I think that was one of the things that I see as a miss is like it was naturalistic. Real quick story, and then I promise to answer your question. This is my mom was like fierce, and I don't know where it came from and where her knowledge came from. She literally was in like advertising for a living, like nothing connected to this field. And my brother, when he started, they had him sit down at a table. So he's probably exactly 2 at this point, and they start like putting out like a few flashcards. And my mom tells me this story. I don't remember this firsthand, but I actually had her on my podcast at one point,
I
and I think we
remember.
talked. Yeah. And she said the like RBT was like trying to get him to match things. And she was like, no, no, lay the whole set down. They're like, no, that's not how we do it. And she's like, trust me, lay the whole set down. And he ended up like matching them all. And they were just going to limit him to these like couple cards.
Mhm.
And my mom's like, no, this is not, he knows what he's doing. He just doesn't have the spoken language to be able to advocate for himself. She also told them, like, we're not going to sit at a table for 40 hours a week. Like, absolutely not. Like,
Good for her.
I want to be out and living. And luckily, she had this RBT who loved to rollerblade, and my mom loved to rollerblade. And my mom
Cool.
will even say she was going through like postpartum for sure and technically it was postpartum that really continued. And exercise was so important for her mental health. But this RBT would literally, they'd go rollerblading with my brother in a jogger stroller, and then they'd stop and they'd do it in the community. So very naturalistic in some ways. In other ways, like, could I tell you for the most part what they were doing? No, because all I remember being told, granted my memory is not always the best, is if he's having a meltdown, ignore it. Like, don't pay attention to him. Which, as a 12 to 14-year-old, like, and not understanding that, I mean, I still don't understand that, if I'm being honest, like, felt so weird. And so the place, I think about this in two ways. The place that I think about this from is that, number one, like, are we treating this child as if they're a human? Right? Like, imagine
Mhm.
someone else doing that and like stepping over them because they're having a meltdown. Like, that feels wrong. Or a friend of mine, Nicole Casey, did a reel recently where she, like, it was this whole elaborate setup of like giving chips at a party, and it's like breaking off little pieces and
Oh
saying
my
to your friends, do you want more? And it was like, would you do that to like adults? Like, no, we shouldn't be doing that to autistic children either.
correct.
And that is the core of everything I think about and I do. I'll pause there because I know that was a long answer, and then I can talk about kind of some of my like current reflections on ABA.
Sure.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. And I think one of the most important messages that I reiterate is that our clients are humans, they are souls, and they're children. Like, we work with mainly children, and we wouldn't treat animals the way a lot of ABA has treated children. And not because people are malicious or are out to do harm. Like, they're being trained in a science that they understand in this way. It's been, adapted to be this way, but it doesn't, not only does it not have to be, it actually should not be this way. It really should not. And I think one of the beautiful things that I like to talk about, and I'm curious what your stance is on it. Um, when we implement ABA, we train on the science of ABA, which is not married to DTT at all. It's just a way of implementing ABA.
Right.
Um, but also, we train on the nervous system and how the
Mm,
nervous system impacts behavior
yes.
and what happens when you're dysregulated to your brain and your ability to process and your ability to use language, whatever language you already have. And we talk about attachment and trauma. And, you know, one of the big things even my office manager has to deal with is the trauma families have faced through ABA when they're calling us. Like, I remember when I first moved to Florida from Toronto, I got a phone call from a mom who yelled at me on the phone. She called me for services for her child and yelled at me, I don't want ABA. And I was like, you called me. Like, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about your experience and what that's meant to you and what that's caused for you and your child. I don't know what you experienced. I can imagine. And, I'll end up at schools who will say I won't have ABA. And then I have to explain myself over and over again about how ABA doesn't have to be that way and we don't implement it in the way you are imagining. And I know that there's a big movement to compassionate ABA. Thank God.
Yeah.
And I recently listened to one of your podcasts about ACT. And I remember going to an ACT training in Toronto years ago and being like, oh my God, finally, like, somebody is doing this. This is amazing. And being in a room full of people who were like, But how do you take data on that? I don't
Mm,
understand. And I wanted to like shake everyone and say, "Are you human? Do you have an inner voice? Do you have your own trauma? Like we all have it. And to ignore it is to ignore our humanity, to ignore
yeah.
that person's humanity." So I'm curious about um, any recommendations you might have around the implementation of ABA or any type of service going to a neurodiverse into the neurodiverse world, because we don't only service, the autistic community, although for insurance purposes, that's usually the population that we service. Usually it's the autistic community, but not always, but the
Yeah.
neurodiverse community in general. And um, any recommendations you have around even, the nervous system implementation, um, and any other recommendations that you might have.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think to tie it back to the previous question as well, this is where I feel like what is missing as a whole within ABA is
Yeah.
it's such a focus on the behavior
Yes.
that we're missing the underlying need of that
Yes.
behavior. What is that behavior communicating? So when we're trying to quote unquote extinguish a behavior, if we reframe it as, oh, we're trying to extinguish communication, and it's like, no, 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 we're not. But like when we use actually the irony, the science of ABA and reinforcement and how that works, right? Like that's actually what we're doing is we're making communication less frequent.
Yep.
And I love, sometimes I'll hear people be like, okay, like it should be a never, and behavioral principles should be a never. And I think a lot of times when I see people respond to those, they end up invalidating why people are concerned about this, right? And there is this middle ground of like, hey, I hear you the way that it's being used, but we also have to recognize like behaviorism as a whole can be used for good too. And that might sound absolutely like controversial, shocking, not neurodiversity affirming. But a quick example of this is modeling. When we model without expectation, we're introducing, say, an AAC device for the first time and we're modeling it, and ultimately, then eventually, without expectation, without pressure, without hand over hand,
Mhm.
all of that, and we're just letting it be. And then the child goes and presses the button for the first time. We need to acknowledge that communication and like how beautiful that is to say, I hear you. I am listening. I am with you right
Right.
now.
Yeah.
And so that's a way that behaviorism still technically is being used. We just don't think of it in that way.
Mhm.
We think of it as connection. We think about it as like validating communication and all of that. And so with ABA, I think as a whole, is I have listened to so many autistic individuals and I hear the trauma and the harm. And that's one of the things, Francis, that I love about the work you do is you're willing to acknowledge it. But
Mhm.
I am seeing this gap right now, if I'm being candid in the ABA field. And I have talked to ABA providers that there's this level of defensiveness that comes about of
Mhm.
like, well, let me tell you how we're doing new ABA. And we know, and it's like, yeah, but you're missing the message of truly hearing what someone is expressing and allowing that to be without having to fix that as an immediate solution, right?
Yeah.
Like, imagine if you truly are doing this, it's pausing, it's hearing, it's collecting the information before having a response. And so when people, when I, know, ultimately, if I challenge a little bit, and Usually I'm doing this because I have a client I'm working with and I'm helping them to find, a good ABA provider. And again, someone might be like, well, why are you doing that as a neurodiversity affirming therapist?
Mhm.
We need to recognize that there's privilege and not receiving ABA sometimes, right? Like there can be significant safety concerns, particularly in the BIPOC community of like learning to hear no and to stop, right? I
Yeah.
mean, unfortunately, we're seeing so many completely mistreated by the police, right? And so
Yes.
that's an example of where we could use ABA, or we might have two working parents that their kid has gotten kicked out of daycare after daycare, and this is the only option for them. So I also think we can't completely disregard it, but then how do we advocate within the people like yourself? And I've come across some other great, BCBAs who are truly neurodiversity affirming and not, oh, well, we're doing new ABA. That right there, when I'm on the phone, is concerns, and you have this templated thing, which then if you're doing that to me as a psychologist and an adult, what are you doing? Have that power position potentially, and you interacting with that autistic child.
Beautiful. Sorry, I think the audio was delayed because it kept cutting out. So I just finished hearing you. Um, I think that that's very powerful. And I spent a lot of time also listening to the autistic community. Um, and I really love to follow parents of autistic children who share their stories, um, and their experiences, and some of them being autistic themselves as well, and what their
Mhm.
life experience has been. And I think it's so important because, and I say this message over and over because I really know nobody goes into the field of helping people to cause harm. Like nobody did it intentionally, right? No,
Mhm.
not me, not anyone that's ever been in this field has gone in to hurt another individual. But I think we really need to, like you said, really need to listen, and not just listen to the voices of those who have experience, but the voices, and and we communicate in more than just our voices. We, our energy speaks, and our facial expressions and our body language. And when you really build a relationship with someone, you can pick up on all those little nuances and know when you're like, oh, okay, we need to take a little break here. I hear you. And a very famous quote is that, like, everyone just wants to feel heard. And
Mhm.
so, everyone wants to feel heard and understood and deeply loved unconditionally. Not that there's anything wrong or that needs to be fixed about them. And I can't imagine spending 40 hours as a child in therapy that was teaching me to be different
Mm.
and to think differently and to express differently, and how that might make me think about myself, is that there's something innately wrong with me. And so I
Yeah.
need to be different in order to be correct or to have access to anything that I like. And it's a painful existence to have, to exist like that. And nobody wants to do that anymore, I don't think.
Yeah.
So I think the message of, listen, like whole body listening, like what we used to say, whole body listening, but like us engaging and whole body and soul listening to what the message is, and being respectful of the message being given and not forceful. This isn't, everything's been so compliance driven. I say, so you do. And that's the opposite of what I want to teach my own children. I don't want my children to be complacent individuals. Why would I teach anyone else's child to walk around and be a complacent individual? So I think it's a very strong and beautiful message. Um, Speaking of compliance, oh, did you want to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I have one more thought because one of the things at all. Oh no,
No, I can hear you. I can hear you.
weird.
You had one more
Still
thought?
can't?
Yeah.
It's really delayed, I feel like.
Yes, it is, but it's
Hear me
okay.
now? Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think okay. Okay. Sorry. I'll start over. I think part of our responsibility too as clinicians and providers is to ultimately we need to do our own inner work too. And so this was one of the things being in academia when I first heard about neurodiversity, it scared me because I was like, oh my gosh, are you going to tell me that like my job isn't going to exist? Right. Because I didn't understand it at the time. I thought it meant that like, well, we shouldn't be diagnosing people and we shouldn't be doing therapy. And that is not true. But it was fear that came about. And it was my own ego too. Of I was trained in a way that it was like you of really truly becoming a neurodiversity of inner parts and realizing like it is yours. And we will and be like, hey Taylor, like I don't quite agree with X, Y, and Z, like an autistic advocate. And I would be like, okay, help me understand. Like I want to keep learning and I want to keep evolving. And so I think that's the thing is a lot of times we're trained in this way that we're supposed to have all the answers. And most of us, if not all of us, have a helper part that wants to come in and fix things and have solutions and, you know, ultimately serve our clients. And while that largely serves us, sometimes it sabotages us too, where our ego comes out, we get defensive. And so we have to also learn to sit with what does it mean to be wrong? What does it mean to not always have the answers? What does it mean that if you learn something new and that means when you think back to past clients that maybe you did cause harm, inadvertently and subconsciously. And there's a lot of discomfort with that, but we don't evolve unless we sit with that discomfort. And so I think honestly, like, yes, super important to learn about neurodiversity. You have to work on this mindset shift holistically before you're ever going to really truly be serving from this autistic child.
Wow. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think what's actually made me a better therapist myself has been my own inner work, my own ability to work on healing parts of
Mhm.
myself and seeing parts of myself. And as you were speaking about, like, what does that mean if you caused harm? Like, and you did that to somebody else. And I remember early on in my career when I was working with my clients, I was like, I had read a little bit and I had met an adult who, when he heard my occupation, turned white and was like, "You're one of those," and walked away. And I was like, "Oh my God, I don't know what you think I am, but I don't want to be whatever you just experienced, within your body." And I was like, oh, when these kids think of me 10 years, 20 years later, I want them to have felt heard, loved, seen, supported. That's what I want them to feel. Like when I think about my teachers that I had in my academic career, it's like my favorite teachers were the teachers that made me feel that way. Not necessarily who taught me the best lessons or, had the most exciting lesson plans. They were the teachers that really made me feel seen and heard and loved and cared about for who I am. And that's more impactful for the rest of someone's trajectory than anything we can actually tangibly teach them, is that there's nothing innately wrong with them. Because if you build that trust and you have that relationship with someone, now you have a
Mhm.
foundation for teaching, anything. That's where I think the beauty lies. Um, that's a really beautiful message. And I'm really glad you shared that. That's really beautiful. Thank you. Um, I
Yeah.
wanted to speak to you about something you speak a lot about, actually. You speak a lot about PDD. And I remember when I first learned about it, I don't know, maybe it was 5 years ago, 4 years ago. I don't remember when I first heard about it. When I read what it was, I was like, oh, I know so many people who would have benefited from me understanding this years ago. So I don't know if
Mhm.
this is the first time a listener is hearing about it, whether they be a therapist of some kind, a parent, or an adult who is neurodiverse, or someone who just knows. Maybe they're even teachers. Can you tell us a little bit about PDD?
Well, so it is PDA. So there
PDA,
was
sorry.
PDD-NOS.
Yes.
Yep, yep, all good. Just because there's so many acronyms in this field. So
Yes.
PDA stands for pa- pathological demand avoidance, or the autistic community really has put forward more like a persistent drive for autonomy or pervasive drive for autonomy.
Mhm.
PDA is interesting. PDA is not a diagnosis. And so that can also create some controversy of like, okay, we don't have enough research on it. It's not in the DSM 5, which is how we diagnose kids. And so we have to find this balance. And I think this is what's really important. I was trained in an evidence based model, always evidence based, but then also a lot of these neurodiversity affirming things don't always perfectly align with evidence based models because research is so incredibly slow.
Mhm.
And so PDA is this perfect concept of listen, we can understand it and validate it and still simultaneously say that we need more research and we need to better understand it. But at the core, the way that I often think of it, is, it is like a hyperactivation of the nervous system where an individual goes into a fight or flight response, sometimes also freeze or fawn, in response to like everyday demands, or kind of either like spoken demands or even just the indirect unspoken demands that exist, and it creates this dysregulation. Sometimes these kids then are misdiagnosed with ODD, oppositional
Mhm.
defiant disorder. And here's the thing: what's really fascinating is, as a clinician, I diagnose autism all the time. Um, I historically I can't say never, I'd have to think back, but pretty much never have diagnosed ODD with autism because I've always conceptualized it as okay, this is dysregulation. And that ODD diagnosis doesn't tell us the underlying need a lot of times. And so I've never been a huge fan, but PDA is one of these things where it can help. I find families start to understand what's going on and how we can use really supportive strategies. Now, with PDA, sometimes you'll hear like low demand parenting go with this. And low demand parenting is a whole topic in and of itself of like people hear that and they're like, oh, you're just having your kid do nothing. And I do think that sometimes I've seen information, it sometimes can swing to the point of permissive parenting.
Mhm.
And I've had families come to me that are in just complete burnout. The family system is in a burnout, it's not working. But we also have to realize that we can be mindful about what demands we're giving, how it is stressing the nervous system, how we're communicating it. All of this can go with it. And so we are lowering demands, but sometimes that's helpful for all kids, sometimes helping
Mhm.
them to understand the why, or you being mindful of what demands am I truly choosing? Like, why do I care about this? Why do I care if my kid gets dressed by 9 a.m. every morning? Right? Like,
Mhm.
is that a rule that, maybe that's how I grew up and I'm handing it down, or is there something internal that, oh, if my kid doesn't get out of their pajamas, I'm a bad parent? Right, exploring all of that as well and really understanding why we're giving these demands. And so I have a therapist friend of mine who he reframes it as high demand high autonomy, or sorry, not high demand. Oh my gosh, high autonomy, high agency parenting instead of low demand. And I really, really love that of like the collaborative model overall.
Oh, I love that. I haven't heard that before. I love that.
Yeah.
And I do um, a lot of the coaching that I do for the, from what I understand, neurotypical population when I'm coaching parents. Um, there is a whole movement around conscious discipline,
Right.
and around, and I think that there's a boundary around conscious discipline that you need to make sure you're still setting boundaries, because then you end up in permissive parenting. And I think that when you're dealing with dysregulated nervous systems and you're dealing with, that's a very different, it's a very different person to deal with than someone who's just saying, no, I make the rules around here. And so I want to be clear that PDA is different than a child running a household. Um, it is a very different dynamic. And so I think it's a beautiful addition and piece of information for parents and also for therapists and for teachers.
Yeah.
And we talk a lot about the nervous system at the play base because I think it is so important to keep in mind and to really tap into, because you're not speaking to the same person when they're dysregulated versus when they're regulated, and understanding what is dysregulating them. And it's not about, fear and avoidance of triggering the dysregulation. It's about honoring the individual and supporting them in the co-regulation or the regulation before anything then takes place. Um, so I think that's a really cool addition. I think all practitioners need to do research if they haven't. I recently provided some research to some of my analysts because of what we're seeing. Um, and as they read it, they're all like, "Oh wow, yes, this sounds exactly like what I needed to read. Thank you so much." So I think the fact that you're speaking out about it and sharing information is incredibly important. Incredibly, incredibly important. You touched on something a little bit earlier that I wanted to touch on before we finish. And that's, so you do assessments as part of your practice. And in my, I don't know, 15, 16 years in the field, I've encountered many people who are afraid of the assessment, afraid of the label, don't want their child to have that label, don't want to, whether it be accept or get to a place of understanding what's going on, whether that be a cultural piece, a personal fear of parents, which I understand.
Mhm.
Um, I'm wondering if you have a perspective to share on when and why assessments and diagnoses can be helpful, um, and why, in some cases, you would recommend to go through with the assessment.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk specifically about kids because adults getting diagnosed for the first time is a whole nother ball game. But the short answer is when is now, right? If
Yeah.
you're questioning it, it is now. And I think one of the biggest pieces that I want parents to understand is I hear you in this and what it feels like the weight of the world. And there, especially we're hearing so much, stigma and misinformation around autism. And I really encourage you to do one of two things. Find a clinician who is going to be gentle in supporting you through this process. This is a big part. I bring the whole family approach into my diagnostic approach as well,
Mm.
of not just like, here's the label, like good luck, or here, or even here's what you do. It's like, okay, let's process. How are you feeling? Where are you at in this? And then I tailor my feedbacks as a result to all of that. But the other thing is it might be going and to therapy yourself and sitting with this of like trying to unpack. I can share, Francis, with you. I do have an episode on grief that I think would be really helpful to give some perspective and like understanding the stages of grief and how you're not grieving your kid, you're grieving the shift in expectations, you're grieving, they're navigating this really neurotypical world, and that means that must be hard for them, and thinking about the future and all of that. But the biggest piece that I want to say, and this can be hard to hear but is so important to think about, whether or not you get your child the diagnostic label, their brain is still wired to be autistic. And some of it is, we don't talk about this enough, is your kid does not change through this process. There is nothing that changes about your kid. You will change as a result of it. You will understand your child so much better. You will know how to support your child and what supports to get them. And you're going to know how to advocate better in order to help them truly thrive. And so, as hard as this is, by not getting a diagnosis and starting that process of understanding, if you don't understand it, they can't understand it. And so, their brain is wired in a way that they're not understanding, that other people aren't understanding them, that you're not even fully understanding them. And that is creating more hardship for your child because you're not getting them the right supports. And so they don't change, and we're doing them a disservice by not pursuing that evaluation and starting the journey. Because I think one of the most transformative pieces of an evaluation, and this is, I think, a misunderstanding too, and I don't think all clinicians do this well, you're starting to understand your child's pattern of strengths and support needs.
Yes.
And so even if sometimes parents say to me like, well, I'm fearful I won't get the diagnosis if I pursue this, a good evaluation is going to tell you more about how your child's brain thinks so you can understand them, as well as give tailored recommendations in terms of next steps. So you're always walking away with something. And you may walk away with that diagnosis and not be ready yet to share it. And again, this is where diving into some of that grief and that processing and what you need is so incredibly important. But we also, at the same point, the goal is to get there. You could even start talking, just about with your kid, like autism generally, or just neurodivergence in general, before you're ever introducing this concept to your child while you're in that waiting period. But it is truly critical. And yes, this is what I do for a living, but I will get on consult calls with families and I will tell them, listen, we would love to have you in the practice, but even if you don't move forward with our practice, I am still recommending an evaluation because I want your family and your child to get the support so that you can collectively understand your child.
Oh, I echo everything you said. I echo it, and I've delivered this message many times because, especially since moving to the States, in order to get insurance to cover your services, you do require a diagnosis.
Mhm.
And so it's a conversation we have that I think happens in a more, I think, nonchalant way, sadly, because it's a part of getting services covered,
Right.
like, oh, you need a diagnosis. But truly, it's not. Yes, there is an element of the label itself, but the most important part of the entire assessment is that it provides you with information about how your child processes, how your child thinks, what are their strengths, how can you support them based on all this information as a parent, as a therapist, as a teacher, all of that. And I think that, I think it's how I want someone to do an assessment on me to understand how my brain works. And I know enough about, the areas where my executive functioning isn't so great. And like, I know myself well enough to know that, but to know the nuances, like even my daughter did vision therapy, has just started vision therapy. Have you heard of vision therapy?
Yeah.
So I had never heard of it in Canada. I don't know if it's a thing in Canada, but when I moved here, we went to the optometrist and he's like, your daughter needs vision therapy. And I was like, what is that? And I sat in the assessment and listened. And I was like, oh, I struggle with those things too. And talking about just the vision piece. And then she broke down my daughter's vision needs that I had
Mm,
no idea. She's 9 years old and I had no idea she had these needs until this past year. And as I'm reading it, I was like, wow, I struggle in some of these areas, not all of them, but in some of these areas too. And I just found it so fascinating. And I was like, that's just vision. There's, and I wanted to do a full assessment on her just to understand where she is with her learning. And I said, okay, I'm going to do the vision therapy first because that's part of, visual processing is part of the assessment. So I
yeah.
was like, oh, let's do this part first. And it's so empowering to know, oh, like my daughter was like, oh, I thought that it was because of my allergies that I had double vision. And I didn't know that, I could get help and that glasses could help me and that vision therapy could, and it's actually empowering to understand yourself and not see yourself as flawed in some way, but as like, oh, this is how my brain works. This is how these are my eyes and this is how they work. It's empowering to have the tools and to understand yourself
Right.
for the individual. But I think for the family, for the teachers, for the therapists, it's like to get a great assessment and to be able to read that report or even speak to the psychologist and be like, wow, this helps me understand how to support this individual. And it's a gift, I think. It's a beautiful gift. Um,
Yeah.
I think you are a wonderful resource to families, to children, and a huge advocate. And I'm so thankful that you took the time to speak with me.
Yeah.
Deeply grateful. Um, I'm going to have all of my clinicians listen because I think it's important what you shared. Um, before we go, how do people contact you? How do people find you if they're interested in listening to your podcast or following you on Instagram or even contacting you for support?
Yeah. So my website is drtaylorday.com, just dr and then my name.com. And then that talks about services. So we do diagnostic evaluations as well as therapy services. Myself and I have a few psychologists working for the practice. We can practice, I believe it's up to 42 states currently. We do virtual services completely. And I know sometimes people are hesitant about that, but truly it's such a naturalistic model that we can get so much information and help to support. But I also love just being able to educate as a whole. And so I create a lot of educational resources. My Instagram and like really any social media is just the Dr. Tay with periods in between. And then the podcast is Evolve with Dr. Tay. And I recently launched a membership as well, that especially if you're consuming information and you want to be able to have a space to ask questions and continue learning in a deeper way, that would just be drtaylorday.com/membership. And you can learn more about that as well.
Oh my God, I love that. Amazing. I didn't know about the membership. Very cool.
I
Okay.
just launched. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
congratulations. That's awesome. And I like to finish with asking you if there are specific words or a question that you want to leave our listeners to sit with before they go. If there's anything specific that you want to have them ask themselves or something you want to share with them.
I think given the theme of this episode and just what I'm so passionate about as well is taking a pause, whether you're a parent or you're a clinician or provider or a teacher, of just really asking yourself about how much you've sat with your own internal parts, right? The part of you to grow. And so this is going to look different. But as a parent, how much have you truly sat with your child's diagnosis and allowed yourself to feel? Because I think so often parents are taught to hop into action mode that they forget to feel the feelings. And then they feel like if they do, shame pops up And it's like, oh, well, I love my child. I accept my child. I shouldn't be feeling these things.
Yeah.
And I think as someone that is working with autistic children, of that part, that ego part, how much is that popping up that's stopping you from learning how to do things differently? Maybe you've had a gut instinct of like, ooh, this doesn't feel right, but I'm told to do this. And how much can you start to lean in and truly explore that?
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. So meaningful, so beautiful. I'm so happy you joined me today. You are absolutely magnificent. Thank you so much, Dr. Tay.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure. And I love this conversation and just how you really are, having these conversations within the context of ABA. I think we need more of these to really change that field from the inside out. But it's not just the ABA field either, right? Like, I think as a whole, in supporting autistic children, we all need to be doing this work and diving in. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.